Hey everyone, C. Rogers here with C. Rogers Media, and today our question comes from Archie Sam via the Facebook group. Archie asks, "Hi guys, is there anyone who does illustrations with a mouse while using Inkscape? How do you do your coloring?" Well, Archie, there are 8 different ways in which I typically color in Inkscape. First one being with color swatches. Second, color gradients. Third, blurs. 4, with clips and clip groups. 5, coloring with the eyedropper. 6, coloring with the fill bucket tool. 7, coloring with paste and paste style. And finally, coloring with object blend modes. So today I'll take you through these 8 methods of coloring in Inkscape. Let's get started. So take, for example, this squirrel on a birdhouse that I have made previously. Our squirrel here is nice. Maybe we want to make him a bit redder. We could do that in the usual way by clicking on, say, the tail, and then clicking on a swatch, like the 4th red swatch here to turn it burgundy. But selecting things and then clicking over and over again kind of is a bit cumbersome. So one little trick that you may not know is that you can actually drag and drop a swatch directly onto shapes, and then you don't have to select and then click, select and then click. You can just click and drag, and we've got our redder squirrel. So that method works well for flat shaded objects, but what about gradients? So if we select our tail and say we want to add a red to pink to purple gradient, we can switch to the gradient tool, which is this one right here, and now we'll just click on our fill. And you can see that we have our flat shaded red here. The second one here is the linear gradient. So if we click that one, it will add a linear gradient. You can also click and drag on the object, and it will make the gradient exactly where you start and end that click. And you can see by default, Inkscape blends it from an opaque red to a transparent red. And these color stops show up here. You can see this one, this color stop is the end one, the one that we have selected, and the alpha is turned all the way down. If we want the transparency to be all the way up, we'll turn that up. And in this case we do, because we'd like to change this to purple. Nice purple color. And we'll move this up a little bit. And here we'd like a nice pink transition, so let's double click on the gradient line here. You can see that adds a stop in between those two colors. And we'll change that to a nice pink color. Turn up the brightness. So now we've got our red to pink to purple gradient. You can also use the radial gradients instead of a linear gradient. This one just goes from this color to this color in a straight line, basically. So if we want a radial gradient, this guy right here will do what we want. If we take, you can see it kind of starts with our red here and kind of goes outward to our pink and purple. And if you want those reversed, there's this little button right here. You can reverse the direction. We'll put this down at the bottom, this up at the top. You can see that when I drag these around, you can kind of control where the oval of the shape goes. So in this case, it's kind of like an oval shape tail anyway, so it works for that purpose. If I want more red here, one trick is to double click close to that red color and then just drag it up, and you can see it kind of adds more separation between those two colors. You can also use a mesh gradient, which is the next one right next to radial gradient. And if you click that one and the gradient tool, you'll see that it has these, it's kind of like a colored mesh here. And if I click here, I can add a color stop. Here, it will actually add grid lines. And you can change the intersections of these lines to other colors. So maybe I want it like green or yellow, maybe to blue. And you can see you can get some pretty complex color transitions that way. You can move these around, you can move the handles to make the colors go in different directions. And those are the basics for using gradients for color. So up to this point, we've been dealing with a black shape with opacity set to 25. You can see if I set that to 100, it's just a black shape. And I like to do that for my shadows, but one of the problems with this, of course, is that we have this sharp edge. And while that works good with this style, sometimes we'd like it to be a little bit more 3D, like a blend from one color to another. Now we could try and do that with the gradient tool, but as you can see, like it doesn't quite it makes this transition nice, but this is still kind of a sharp edge. What we really like to do is kind of blur this edge to make that nice transition, and unsurprisingly, that's where blur comes into effect. We can click once on our fill to bring up the fill and stroke dialog, and at the bottom we've got our opacity and our blur. So if we turn up our blur, it's going to blur in both directions, vertically and horizontally, and we can increase our opacity here a little bit to bring that nice shadow in. As of Inkscape 1.3, you can also change the direction of the blur as well. So if we then click on our node tool, you can see we've got these nice handles that will blur in one direction or the other. So I can blur it. It's kind of like a speed blur, and maybe if I turn this up a bit more, you can see it better. You can see I can really stretch this out in one direction, so it looks like we have a really fast squirrel. This one here. We can extend it in the vertical direction and bring this down so that it only blurs in this. And we'll use that a bit more to our advantage when we're going over clips. You can see one of the big problems with this method is that while we have a nice transition here, it's still got this overlap. We'd like to cut it to the interior of the tail. And then if you want to have those both the same, again, you can actually just go back to the blur slider and it'll even them out for you. So now let's see if we can get rid of some of this overlap with clips. So we've got this nice soft shadow, but we'd really prefer if it didn't extend beyond the boundary of, say, our tail. Turns out that's pretty easy to fix. We just edit, copy that tail shape, select the shadow and choose edit, paste, paste in place. Now we have a copy of that tail shape pasted over our soft shadow. We need to select both the tail and the shadow. One way we can do that is to hold Shift and Alt and then click the shadow underneath, and that will select them both. Then we can right click and set clip. That does exactly what we wanted. It clips off, and that gives us our nice clean cut result. So that's pretty useful, but turns out there's an even more useful way, and that's by creating a clip group. To do that, we just select our tail again, as before, but instead of copying and pasting, we're just going to right-click and choose Set Clip Group. Now, nothing looks like it's changed, but down here you can see instead of a path, it's a group of one object clipped. What that means is we can then copy both our tail piece and shadow, and we're just going to cut those, click into our clip group, and then paste in place as we did before. Now we've pasted these into that clip group, and you can see it makes quite a nice cut off there. But even better is the fact that if you then modify your original shape by clicking down into the group, Inkscape is smart enough to then redo your clip. So you can see how it kind of overlaps here, and then when you drop it, it sets the clip on that shadow automatically. So then you don't have to go back and unclip things and reclip them, and yeah. So this is nice, especially if you've got more than one shape to clip. For example, if I want maybe a highlight, I can click into this group and we will take this. You can see that I didn't have to clip this shape. It's automatically clipping because it's in that group, and then I can blur it and make a nice highlight. So yeah, I use a lot of clip groups and a lot of clipping in my soft shadow graphics. And that just about wraps up how to use clips and clip groups. Another great tool for coloring is the dropper tool, which is also hotkey D on your keyboard. When you switch to this tool, you can see our icon changes to an eyedropper, and how you use this is exactly how you would sample from like swatches and other things. You just select the object, click the eyedropper tool, and click over whatever color you want to select, which is kind of nice, but actually it's even better than that. Say we want kind of this overall orange, but you can see as we click around, it's hard to get this overall orange by just clicking on individual pixels. If we click and drag, we can actually get a sample of that whole area in terms of color. Maybe I want a little bit more saturated. And you can see you can make color palettes really easily by doing this. So typically how I make an on-canvas color palette is I'll make a series of squares and then a circle to be my temporary color object. And what that does is it allows me to use the eyedropper tool to sample. And when I have a color that I like, I can actually hold down the control key. And you can see that when I hold down the control key, it changes the cursor into color drop mode. Now if I click, I can actually drop that color onto this. I can drop it onto multiples if I want, or I can go back and get another color here, and notice that it's just changing this color. It's not changing the other ones. So now I can drop that color if I like it. Yeah, maybe I'd like a darker color here. Yeah, I'll get even darker here. And finally, we'll pull in a green. Yeah. So you can see you can make rather nice color palettes very, very fast without having to reselect all of these things. You could have done that just by selecting each one of these, but it's just easier to have your sampler object here and use that as the object that's selected. Because remember, every time you click, you're going to change whatever you have selected. So sometimes it's nice to just have an extra shape there to take all of the color changes and then apply what you want to these ones with the color dropper mode, which is, again, holding control. So you might have encountered a situation where you have a shape here, but instead of nice stroked lines, you get kind of this weird fill situation that just imitates lines. So this is kind of difficult to color in the way that we have been, since it's just one shape. You might be tempted to use the paint bucket tool, also called the fill bucket tool, to sort of fill in these areas. But you can see right away that it doesn't do a fantastic job. Reason is because it's actually taking screen pixels and trying to figure out the boundaries of your enclosed shapes in this. And you can see that if you zoom out quite a lot and try and fill it in, you get kind of a worse effect. And by the same means, if you zoom in really closely, you can get somewhat more accurate, but you can see it's still not exact. I don't recommend using the paint bucket tool for this kind of coloring, which is, it seems like it should be the kind of coloring that you'd want. You can kind of remedy that situation by choosing like grow and shrink by turning it up to something, and that will create like some overlap. But you can see it kind of creates rounded edges, which may be fine. But what the fill bucket tool is really useful for is making shapes out of the gaps in between other shapes. Not exact shapes, but for example, if we use our picture here, we can kind of do a limited vector trace using our paint bucket tool. Let's go ahead and turn down the shrink back to 0. Say I want kind of this dark area that's filled in by the tail here. You can play with the threshold, kind of get an area that encompasses that. So now I have this cool shape that would be really hard to make yourself, and maybe you can use that for shading and other bits like that. But I kind of see the fill bucket tool as an auto trace tool, like a selective auto trace. Also, something else to note is that you can click and drag it. It'll start with the color that you start to click on. So if I want the top of this fern, for example, I start clicking on the light area, and you can actually click and drag, and it will kind of try and search out areas that are connected to that, and then you can add more to it. So yeah, that's typically what I use the paint bucket tool for. It's just more useful for that. So what I recommend you do is to break this apart into different shapes, so we can use the methods that I've shown you before with the eyedropper tool or the swatches, etc., to just select and color individual shapes. We can do that by choosing path, break apart. And what that does is it breaks all the interior shapes into separate shapes. And we can see the effect of this if we right-click and choose 25% transparency, which makes overlapping shapes darker. Now we can see all of our separated shapes. We have a problem here, though, where the biggest shape is on top. So what I'll typically do is just move that down our layer stack into the bottom. You can also use lower to bottom button to do that as well. And now we can just select individual shapes. Typically, I will turn this back to 100% transparency and then select everything up until the very edge of there, which will select the interior shapes, and turn those white. So now if we turn those up to 100% opacity, you might have to tweak the pieces here. That one's also behind. So we'll move that up. Now we can select our individual shapes and use our eyedropper tool, for example, to color in our other bits, right? As we did before. Remember, holding Control when we want to switch colors, we can just switch to the eyedropper tool again and, do that. Which brings us to our next method of coloring, which is one of my personal favorites, and that's the paste style method. So instead of using an eyedropper, I can actually just select a color. And I can copy it with Control C or edit copy. But I mean, since we're trying to do this faster, I just do Control C, seriously. So Control C is copy and Control V is paste, but we don't want to paste the shape. We want to paste the style. We do that through edit, paste. So if we choose style here, Shift Control V as the hotkey. So that's what I usually use. Control C and Shift Control V. So when we do that, Shift Control V, we can paste the color of these directly onto shapes. Shift Control V, Shift Control V, Shift Control V, Control C, Control Shift V, Shift Control V, and yeah, you can see that's pretty fast. So the last thing we'll cover is one of my favorite tricks to coloring in Inkscape, and it's more about changing color than it is about adding initial color, and that is using blend modes of objects. So for example, say I want my squirrel and bird house here to be in kind of a night scene. So I've made this nice gradient, kind of like a night sky sort of situation. What I can do is just switch the blend mode. Again, this is in the fill and stroke dialog. At the very bottom, you get blend mode, which you can change to a variety of things. One of my favorites is soft light. And you can see immediately that this actually changes the color of everything that is under it so that it looks like it's more in a night scene. It just adds a little bit of that nice purple to the entirety of all the shapes. Now, like, imagine if you had to do this manually, like selecting individual shapes and changing the color tint. This is a way to save you just a ton of time. Also, you can instantly make it daytime, right? So again, we'll go to soft light, and there are definitely other options that you can do here. Like, this is kind of a little bit too saturated, so you can turn down the opacity of that object to make it influence it less. Or you can use something like this white circle, like maybe suck all the color out of your image with saturation. So we have everything in black and white now, or you can play with the opacity of that and have kind of like a sepia vintage look, or you can have something like this, which is just a gradient from white to gray. Or actually, in this case, it's just white to white transparent. You can then have like part of the object that is colored and part of it that's not. You can see there's a lot of room to play with colors of all different types. Another thing I like to do is actually just kick it right into gradient mode by double clicking on a shape with a gradient, and by selecting the gradient tool and just kind of messing around with the colors, So maybe like we want this to be orange and maybe orange to purple, which gives it just like a completely different sort of feeling to it. And then you can stretch these out so that it's more of a subtle transition, like an evening shot, and completely non-destructive, like you've got your originals here. It's just a great way to color things very, very fast. This setting is also now in the layer itself as this little icon, so you can open this up and choose one of these, which is nice, or opacity. That's in Inkscape 1.3 and above. Hope you had a bit of fun learning this with me today. If you like this video and want to learn a ton more useful tips and tricks using Inkscape for your projects, you can grab a copy of my book, Design Made Easy in Inkscape. It contains over 300 pages across 15 chapters. It's available in both ebook and paperback formats, and is an all-around excellent book to take you from beginner to expert in Inkscape using real-world design examples. Altogether, there are over 400 diagrams, which I've hand-illustrated in Inkscape, and the book even covers brand new features added in Inkscape 1.3. Aside from being an excellent lesson book for Inkscape, every book sold also gives me more time to answer your questions and make new free Inkscape videos. You can also support my work directly on Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Price of a coffee, right? Your funding also supports my volunteer work in the Inkscape project to help make Inkscape easier, better, and faster for everyone. Thanks for watching, and as always, when you design, design freely.